Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. If you have lived long enough to be able to recall what gaming was like in the mid-90s, then in all likelihood you can remember what an impact that Killer Instinct would have on the gaming scene. These loud, violent video games created using silicon graphics computers were not like anything we had ever seen previously, and the original game's unique look, memorable characters and unforgettable combo system would earn the title a special place in history as one of those titles that would help define a period. Not only today are we going to go back and look at this game, but all of Killer Instinct's subsequent sequels too. So sit back, relax and enjoy this movie-length episode whereby we shall be exploring the world of Orchid and Fulgore in depth. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Killer Instinct. Yeah!
The year is 1994. Our story starts out with a British video game developer Rare. Over time, Rare had evolved from a little company known as Ultimate Play the Game, who had released several successful games on the ZX Spectrum. Past this point, the company infamously reverse engineered the Japanese Famicom, even though previously Nintendo had claimed it would be impossible to decode. Through this, Rare would show several tech demos to Nintendo, which they were so impressed with that they would grant the company an unlimited budget for them to work on games for the platform. From here, in preparation for the system's release in the West, Rare would establish offices in the US, which were involved in maintaining Rare's operations in the country and contacting major US publishers. In total, Rare would produce over 60 games for the NES and several additional GameBoy conversions. In total, this would generate a lot of money for the company, which would lead them to invest their significant NES profits in purchasing expensive silicon graphics workstations to make three-dimensional models. This move made Rare the most technological advanced developer in the UK and situated them high in the international market too. Once again, Nintendo were hugely impressed with the progress with the 3D graphics Rare had made. So, this would result in Nintendo even going as far to buy a 25% stake in the British company, making Rare a second-party Nintendo developer. Rare now had enough recognition to be able to use Nintendo's intellectual properties within their games, which would result in the birth of the Donkey Kong Country series. Donkey Kong Country was both a commercial and critical success, with the first game being ranked as the second best-selling Super Nintendo game of all time. As Donkey Kong Country was being developed, Rare were working on other projects simultaneously, due to having more financial power than ever before. During this period, Rare would triple their members of staff from 84 to 250. Another game they were working on at the same time as Donkey Kong Country is of course the very subject of this video, the fighting game known as Killer Instinct. Killer Instinct was another title developed, taking advantage of the silicon graphic technology. Whilst Donkey Kong Country was made for the SNES, Killer Instinct on the other hand was an arcade game with the full intentions of being made to be ported to the Nintendo 64 originally. Whilst the game was developed by Rare, the game was published in the arcades by Midway. The reason as to why Rare were working with Midway in the arcades was due to the fact that Nintendo had recently signed a licensing agreement with WMS Industries, Midway's parent company. This licensing agreement gave Midway access to both develop and market games using an arcade board that was based off of the future Nintendo 64, which was obviously known as the Ultra 64 when it was still in development. Through this partnership, Williams and Nintendo would be able to market home conversions of these arcade games as Nintendo exclusives. Through this elaborate plan, Killer Instinct was announced to be the very first game as part of this project. This came as a shock and surprise to many due to Nintendo's well-known stance against violent video games. Many would speculate about this upcoming game, which would lead to Nintendo's Director of Marketing, George Harrison, to state, Williams would not have entered into this deal if they thought their hands would be tied. We won't restrain them in any way. During this same statement, Harrison would claim Nintendo's stance against violence was no longer necessary due to the new industry standard rating system that had become in prior to the game's release. Killer Instinct would see an arcade release in autumn of 1994. The impressive game would also be the first arcade title to take advantage of an internal hard drive disc, in addition to the game's ROMs. Through all of this, Killer Instinct was capable of storing huge amounts of data, leading the game to have more detailed graphics than other games from the same genre. Like Donkey Kong Country, Killer Instinct features pre-rendered sprites and backgrounds created using the wonderful powers of Silicon graphic computers. The backgrounds in Killer Instinct are stored as movies, which adjust frames based on players' movements. Clever stuff that resulted in amazing visuals for the time, automatically making Killer Instinct stand out from a graphical perspective alone. During the arcade's introductory scene, the game's announcer shouts out that the game will be available for your home in 1995, only on the Ultra 64, instantly teasing players that this game would be one day available in the living rooms. The intro also shows some pre-rendered scenes showing off various characters in the game, before finally bringing us to the player select. The player select screen lets us scroll between the game's 10 initial playable characters. We shall now run through all of these characters shortly, but first I feel it is important to touch upon this game's story. In this game's universe, a mega corporation exists, known as Ultratech. The people of Ultratech organise a special fighting tournament, known as Killer Instinct, hence the name of the game. Through this tournament, hosted by the corporation, alongside regular participants who have entered the tournament, are a range of experimental creatures created by Ultratech. The point of the tournament was so that they could test out the strength of their creations. Apart from all of this nonsense taking place, Ultratech also discovered technology capable of bridging dimensions, releasing a two-headed monster known as Idol into their realm. Idol obviously serves as the game's final boss, which we shall touch more on later. So the combatants in this tournament are obviously the 10 playable characters. Out of these we have Chief Thunder, a Native American chief armed with twin tomahawks, who has entered the tournament to find out what happened to his missing brother Eagle. Next up we have a fiery individual known as Cinder. Cinder, however, is just the entity's codename, and in reality he is a convicted criminal known as Ben Ferris. Ben was promised early parole in exchange for participating in Ultratech's chemical weapons research. As a result of an accident during testing, his body is composed entirely of flame. Ultratech has promised to restore him to normal if he can defeat Glacius. Who is Glacius, you may ask? Well, Glacius is an alien who was captured by Ultratech and promised freedom if he wins the tournament. Glacius was on a visit to planet Earth, looking for a lost brethren. Moving on, we have Riptor, a genetically engineered velociraptor human hybrid created as a prototype by Ultratech themselves. He has been placed in the tournament to test out his abilities as a killer machine by the company. Then we have Saberwolf, or Sabertooth as I like to call him. Kudos to you if you understood that reference. Anyway, Saberwolf is a gentleman afflicted with lycanthropy, or, to put it simply, werewolf syndrome. Like Glacius, he too was captured by those scallywags over at Ultratech and has been driven completely mad by their experimentation. We also have Spinal, who looks like a skeleton. Spinal was a dead individual who was reanimated through cell regeneration. Spinal is fighting with the double motivation of freedom and avenging his own death. Spinal comes equipped with a sword and shield and has the ability to teleport. Onto a more human character, we have TJ Combo, a former 5-time heavyweight boxing champion. Anyway, Mr. Combo was stripped of his title and expelled from the circuit after it was discovered he was naughtily cheating by using secret cybernetic implants in his massive arms. Ultratech promised him he could regain his prestige by winning their tournament. Another completely human character is Jago, who is a Tibetan monk and a powerful warrior. Abandoned as a baby, he was found by the monks of the Tiger, an order who worship an ancient deity known as the Tiger Spirit. After years of training in the monastery, Jago was chosen as the Tiger Spirit champion, and as a result granted new powers. The Tiger Spirit ordered Jago to enter the fighting tournament so that he could destroy Ultratech. Jago also has a sister, known as Orchid, the game's answer to Chun-Li. Orchid is an enigmatic and a lethal secret agent for a vigilante-orientated international spy organisation. Posing as a secretary, she infiltrates Ultratech, the company which organises the Killer Instinct tournament, to uncover the truth behind the mysterious disappearances related to it. The last selectable character we are yet to discuss is Fulgore, a cyborg and the penultimate opponent in single-player mode. This character, also developed by Ultratech, is the first in a planned series of state-of-the-art cyborg soldiers. He was designed to resemble a knight to help gain the people's trust, but rumours say the human parts used in its construction originated from an organ harvesting operation based in Moscow. Finally, from the character lineup, we have the final boss, Idol. Idol appears as a massive two-headed cyclops with glowing red eyes and goat-like legs with cloven hooves. He wields a massive spiked mace and is the tallest character in the game. He is the most formidable opponent you will encounter within a playthrough. Prior to making this video, I was already familiar with this colourful roster due to the huge amount of hours playing this game as a kid, but I must say that until today I was not familiar with the game's ridiculous storyline and where the characters all fit in. Now though that this video exists, I have even more appreciation for the crazy characters than I once did. Give me any of these rare characters in Smash Brothers over Banjo Bloody Kazooie any day of the week. As you can see, the unique character design and beautiful graphics were both huge driving factors in Killer Instinct's popularity. But away from that, how did the gameplay and controls handle? Let's explore that aspect. Like many fighters, the meat and potatoes of Killer Instinct is the one-on-one combat. The game clearly cherry-picks a lot of its features from successful fighting games that came before it. For example, the game features combos similar to the Street Fighter series, a monstrous cast much like the Darkstalkers series, and even brutal finishing moves inspired by Mortal Kombat. Sadly though, you are going to have to look those up yourself, as I would prefer this video to stay monetized. Apart from the gorgeous graphics and unique lineup of characters, the game has a number of other features that help distinguish this game from its contemporaries, so let us run through some of these factors. Rather than a round system like in many fighting games, instead Killer Instinct trades this feature out for a double energy bar. Both fighters have 2 bars of energy each, and the first player to deplete both of their opponent's bars wins. Next we have the game's combo system, perhaps the most memorable mechanic of Killer Instinct. Some of these flashy combos are even automated after a short initial button press sequence. In regards to the game's Mortal Kombat-like finishing moves, each character has at least 2 of its own equivalent to a fatality. These are known as No Mercies, which would be renamed Danger Moves down the line. These include brutal finishes which, as already stated, I am not going to show you, but they are out there on the information superhighway for you to view nonetheless. What I can show you though is humiliation moves, which force your opponent to dance. Another flashy way of finishing an opponent off is by performing an ultra combo, which consists of one character delivering a long string of hits as a combo finisher, usually surpassed in 20 hits and sometimes reaching upwards of even 80 hits. If you have played this game, the announcer shouting "Combo Breaker" will also be firmly etched in your mind. It is obviously quite self-explanatory what a combo breaker is, but essentially it is when a fighter breaks a combo. If a combo is successfully broken, a white starburst will appear at the tip of the breaker's health bar. This opens the ability to perform advanced versions of some of the special moves that require different command combinations. So, as you can see from all of this, Killer Instinct is a fighting game with a very unique flavour that allowed it to stand out from the pack in every way. This felt like an extremely important game to me when I was a child, and the first fighter that had really hooked me since the release of Street Fighter 2. Killer Instinct felt like the real deal. The game was a big hit in the arcades, and I have fond memories of playing the game in airports, bowling alleys and pubs. The game had a surprising amount of reach. The game was both a commercial hit and critically acclaimed, with EGM stating the game was for now the undisputed king of the arcades, which is exactly how I felt about the game, to be fair. Next Generation would also review the game, stating that it's not the breakthrough title we're all waiting for, and sooner a new genre has to explode. But for the moment at least, Nintendo's plans for the Ultra 64 seem to be progressing smoothly. Looking at this publication's response, it kind of echoes the desperate mentality of the time which many journalists seem to have to see 2D fighting games cease to exist in place of 3D ones. Fortunately though, I think we have now moved past this way of thinking. Entertainment Weekly loved the game and gave the arcade release an A+, the publication's highest possible grade. As we know, whilst the arcade game claimed in its introduction that the game would be arriving on the Ultra 64 game console in 1995, that unfortunately was never to be, as the Ultra 64 got delayed, and had its name changed to the Nintendo 64 and did not reach the public until 1996. Unfortunately, due to these circumstances, the original version of Killer Instinct would never make it to the Nintendo 64 at all, and instead would see release on the Super Nintendo in 1995 instead. As a result, this game would become a beloved member of my childhood SNES collection. Considering that the game was planned to be released on the Ultra 64, it is surprising in some ways that it was even possible to put the game on the SNES, but Rare would try their best nonetheless, with some pretty decent results in my opinion, especially when you consider the hardware limitations. The game would be the second series to arrive on the platform featuring characters made using Silicon graphic computers, after the successful release of Donkey Kong Country. The cartridge itself would even really stand out, as it came exclusively in black, rather than the ugly, regular shade of grey, which was a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. So let's talk about what Rare did to this game to make it run on the SNES. As you would expect, the graphical detail in the game was vastly reduced to that of its arcade counterpart. This would include making character sprites much smaller. The stages, which once had 3D padded cameras, were altered to feature more simple 2D panning, using parallax scrolling for the backgrounds and mode 7 for the ground or arena. This was a clever workaround that took advantage of what the Super Nintendo could do, and helped create pseudo 3D effects. The cool zooming and scaling effects present in the arcade game were completely removed, and some stages were even redesigned too. The FMV that was present in the arcade game's intro was replaced with simple still images. The game's music quality was reduced, voice and sound effect samples were shortened and in some cases removed, and graphical effects on some special moves were taken out too. Whilst this sounds like a lot to be removed from a game, for a Super Nintendo title it still remained very impressive and a game that most wanted amongst their collections. It wasn't all bad either when it come to the port, as some new modes were added, including both a training mode and a tournament mode for multiplayer fun. Thinking back, I have good memories of playing tournament mode with family members when I was very young. The SNES version of this game sold very well at 3.2 million units worldwide, meaning that the release on the 16-bit hardware was financially a very good move. There was a GameBoy version too, but if I ever talk about that version, I think I'll save it for an episode of handhelds around the world, as the arcade and SNES versions are both two huge stories to cover in their own rights. With regards to the SNES version, let's have a look at what the critics made of this port. The publication Video Games gave the game a score of 8 out of 10, putting the title in their great category, claiming it was even better than Mortal Kombat 3, which personally I completely agree with. Entertainment Weekly gave the SNES version of the game an A and praised the quality of the port, ranking it only slightly lower than the A+ they gave the arcade version, acknowledging the great effort of porting such an impressive arcade game to a limited system. GamePro on the other hand would be less generous with their critique, criticising the game's lower frame rate than its arcade counterpart, and just about everything else that had been axed from the arcade version. Their conclusion though was that this version of Killer Instinct isn't flawless, but it is still surprisingly addictive and fun to play. EGM had a panel of 4 reviewing the game, with some varied opinions bringing forth quotes such as, "While it's a nice attempt on the Super Nintendo, it wasn't the same," whilst another journalist called it a superb translation. To be fair, both are fair statements. The best compliments though would come from other sources, with Computer and Video Games saying Rare weren't lying when they said the home version would play better than the coin-op, but no one realised they were talking about the SNES. And Next Generation would heap similar praise, stating Nintendo and Rare have managed one very impressive trick, getting the 16-bit Super NES to display 512 colours at once, twice the usual number, which gives the graphics an extra gloss. When you actually go back and look at Killer Instinct, it is one of the greatest technical feats amongst the Super Nintendo's entire library, and that is before you take into account how fantastic this game plays as well. All in all, I've really enjoyed talking about Killer Instinct, and making this video has helped remind me what an impactful and important fighting game Killer Instinct really was. It was a breath of fresh air in every category in both the arcade and with a surprising arrival on the Super Nintendo. Like seriously, what an outrageous feat by the British game development house. It is no surprise at all that together Rare and Nintendo would somehow go on to hold up the flailing Nintendo 64 on their own. What a game and what a company. I bloody love Killer Instinct.
So, of course, with most gaming success stories, development of a sequel soon commences, and the story of Killer Instinct is no different in this regard. Apparently, Killer Instinct was always a title that a sequel was envisioned for. However, the assumption within Rare originally was that the game would be a home console exclusive. So, whilst the first Killer Instinct game did appear in the arcades, this initially only occurred in the hopes that it would continue to build hype for the Ultra 64 platform. However, the game proved even more popular in cabinet form than the developers expected. So, like the first game, development of Killer Instinct 2 would begin life as an arcade game, with the intention of bringing the title home at a later date. As with all titles, as great as the first Killer Instinct game was, the developers never had the opportunity to squeeze everything into the game that they had originally intended. So some of the additions that were included in Killer Instinct 2 were ideas that were scrapped from the first game due to time constraints or space issues. The game was also programmed based on listening to consumer feedback from those who had played the first game and looked to improve on areas that were seen as a bit lacking. The game would be continuously refined throughout the duration of its development cycle, which would even include the game's artists creating additional animation frames right up until the final few weeks before the game's release. The game was worked on tirelessly by Rare employees. The game went through its final beta tests in late 1995, before finally seeing an arcade release in early 1996. Stakeholders in the game were keen to continue to make money off of this popular franchise. Personally, I would get my opportunity to play this game for the first time on holiday in Florida with my family back in 1996. The complex we were staying on happened to have a Killer Instinct 2 cabinet, which I spent a lot of money on. I was blown away with the game and had a lot of fun with this on the trip. I obviously would even fantasise about one day owning the title on my future Nintendo 64. I bloody loved this new game. Speaking of the future, nearly 20 years later in 2015, I was on another visit to Florida. I'd been talked into visiting a location known as Westgate Lake Resort, where if I visited and listened to their timeshare pitch, they would give me free entry to all the Universal parks. This was obviously an offer I could not refuse, but not the most interesting part of this story. As soon as I made it to the reception area of this location, I quickly realised I was back in the exact same building where I experienced the glorious Killer Instinct 2 19 years earlier. However, sadly, the cabinet was no longer anywhere to be seen. But what a surprising nostalgia buzz that all was, nonetheless. With regards to the timeshare pitch, I would get my Universal tickets, but turned the offer down for the actual timeshare, as ridiculously the money they expected me to pay them monthly for their very average accommodation would have cost me more a month than it would to actually pay my monthly mortgage payments, and all that money would have just paid for somewhere to lie my head for just 2 weeks every year. Certainly an offer that was bespoke for people with more money than actual sense in their heads. But the universal tickets and the Killer Instinct 2 nostalgia definitely made the short visit worth it. As I don't know whether these great memories would have been triggered without the experience. But is the game as great as I remember? Let's take a look. Like many fighting games, Killer Instinct follows a story narrative to give characters an actual reason to be trying to kill each other. Killer Instinct 2 follows exactly where the first game left off, which ends with the death of the game's last boss, Idol, which was at the hands of Orchid. This event accidentally sets off a time warp, transporting the tournament combatants back in time, allowing a demon lord known as Gargos to escape from Limbo. The original game survivors of the Killer Instinct tournament are now all trapped 2,000 years back in the past, along with some new faces who we shall get to shortly. Each of the characters in the game all have their own story arcs and different motivations for fighting. For example, TJ Combo just wants to return home, whilst other characters' main motivations is simply to end the game's new final boss's reign of terror. There is no tournament story here or grand prizes, just a huge fight with the fate of mankind hanging in the balance. As for this title's actual gameplay, much of the game's fighting is very similar to the entry's predecessor. Fights take place with two characters facing off, with the sole goal of depleting the opponent's life bars. Just like with the first game, mechanically the game differs in this aspect than with many other fighters, as rather than having a round system, if a character's life bar is depleted, they simply fall to the ground, then immediately get up and begin fighting with a second life bar. Victory is achieved when you deplete both of your opponent's bars. Once again, much like the first game, Killer Instinct 2 features an automatic combo subsystem within its contests, which revolve around a 3-strength system of quick, medium and fierce attacks. Mechanically, tweaks were made to the second game in the series, which would include normal moves losing some of their priority and range, as well as characters gaining extra recovery time. Throws were also added into the game, and characters can now be knocked over easier using normal moves. The main reasoning for this was to prevent the possibility of glitch combos and weakening the effectiveness of regular attacks. Certain special moves in this game are capable of breaking other special moves, similar to that of a game of rock, paper, scissors. Further to this, super bars were added to the game, similar to the meters found in Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo and the Street Fighter Alpha series. The super bars fill up as players take hits or when attacks are blocked by the opponent. Once the meter is filled high enough, multiple hit super moves are executable, which are extended versions of special moves. The combo system itself is still heavily based off the one that was featured within the first game in the series. With a simple press the button, with the right openings, players can perform auto doubles and initiate the game's combo system. Players now have the ability to open up combos with less risky maneuvers, such as with a fierce punch or kick. Super moves can also now be placed into combos, increasing damage and potency to sequences. Combos can also easily be extended by using throws and other simple techniques. All in all, the game has become more combo focused than ever before, which makes a lot of sense considering the combo system was one of the most dazzling features of the previous game. Speaking of the combos, another of the franchise's staples, combo breakers, were made even easier to perform, as combos are now broken depending on the type of attack. Punches break kick doubles, and kicks will break punch doubles. The ability to parry attacks was also added to the game, before Street Fighter 3 I may add. Basically, parry moves allow an open counter-attack after a successful parry block. According to the designer, Ken Lobb, eliminating excessive defense play was the absolute highest priority. I felt that this was not a problem for experts, but it hurt beginners. We now reward the aggressor big time. The title's finishing maneuvers have also been improved, in that they can now be executed when opponents' life bars go into the red, and a Mortal Kombat fatality-like system also made a return. However, Killer Instinct's fatalities are less crude, brutal, and do not feature any actual dismemberment. In terms of the playable fighters featured within this game, there are a total of 11 selectable fighters. The majority of the roster featured in the previous game make a return, however a few were omitted due to various reasons. The characters missing from this game include Idol, Chief Thunder, Cinder and Riptor, who are each replaced with 4 new characters, who we shall discuss now. Considering Orchid was by far the most popular character from the original game, it would make a lot of sense to add another female to the roster. This brings us to Maya Felgueros, an Amazonian warrior who is from the time zone the game takes place in. She has defeated the game's main villain Gargos previously, but when he reappears in this game, she feels she has let her tribe down, so sets out to destroy him once and for all. Maya's revealing jungle bikini earned her a place among the worst dressed of 1996, according to Nintendo Power anyway. The magazine also nominated her Elephant Drop Ultimate Combo move for its That Gotta Hurt award. Very 90s. The game also features the Conan the Barbarian-like Tusk. Tusk wants to fight all challengers as he would like the pleasure of destroying Gargoyle himself. According to the in-game lore, Tusk actually marries Maya after the events of Killer Instinct 2, earning him some well-deserved snoo for the efforts. Once again, leading on from the success of Orchid, Kim Woo was added to the game's roster, a young East Asian ninja girl. She is a descendant of the people who repelled Gargos and Idol the first time around, and to protect her people, she sets out to stop Gargos once and for all. Finally, to round off the game's new fighters, we have the game's final boss himself, who is of course Gargos. We have already talked about him plenty, but to hammer him home, Gargos is a demon lord who has returned to the physical world. Himself and Idol were locked in combat for thousands of years prior to the events of the first game. Obviously, with the defeat of Idol in Killer Instinct's first entry, Gargos is ready to begin his new conquest, so must be stopped by the fighters at all costs. Like Idol in the original game, Gargos may be accessed as a playable character with the use of a cheat code. So, now we have talked about both gameplay and character changes to the game, let's talk about what wowed me the most, so much, when I played this game for the first time all the way back in 1996. The game's amazing visuals, of course. The graphics and visuals in this game, like everything else, featured a major overhaul of its own. The title's rotational 3D multi-layered parallax backdrops were made to look even more diverse than before. With the game being set 2,000 years prior, everything in this game just looks a tad more, well, exotic and ancient looking. I guess as well, with the wealth of experience I would have had with the Super Nintendo version of Killer Instinct, by the summer of 1996, Killer Instinct 2 would have looked even shinier and more polished against it as a result. The game was pretty breathtaking looking for its time, and looked a lot cleaner than the existing 3D fighting games that were already in existence, such as Virtua Fighter and Tekken. Killer Instinct 2 featured a very different aesthetic, which personally I think has aged a lot better than early 3D polygon games. The game's great visuals were once again paired with a fantastic soundtrack, offering up consumers a perfect combo. See what I did there? Whilst, as mentioned, I was very clearly impressed with this game and could not wait to one day get it home. Video game critics' perspectives at the time were more mixed, with the game receiving more average reviews from them. Next Generation commented that, while the game includes new fighting elements such as the super bar, the essence of the original game is essentially recycled. They also criticised that, while the characters are large and more detailed, this is at the cost of the slower game speed and a choppier frame rate. Summarising that, if you like the style of fighting that relies more on memorising combos than hand-eye coordination and, in a way, skill, Killer Instinct 2 is full of that same fighting style. They scored it 3 out of 5 stars. Despite reviews like this from the period, I find it quite rare to find someone who experienced this game with much negativity regarding it. If you ask me, the game was the perfect fighter for the mass market to appreciate. The game was beautiful, flashy and had a barrier for entry low enough for most people to be able to pick up and play it. Looking back, the only real criticism you could really give the game is that it was not as complex as some other fighting games. But then again, the future of gaming would reveal that complex fighting games like Street Fighter 3 would not catch on with the mass market, like more simplistic games such as Tekken 2 would manage to achieve. So I feel some of the reception that Killer Instinct 2 got at the time was probably a little harsh. In regards to my dream of getting Killer Instinct 2 home, as time progressed that was looking less and less likely. Eventually in my own country I would receive Killer Instinct Gold on my Nintendo 64, which would be released in late 1997. I would receive the game for Christmas that year, and whilst many consider the game a port, I personally think too many changes were made to the title to consider the game as such. To top this off, the game would suffer from many graphical downgrades, which was a huge disappointment for me as a child, as Nintendo had hyped that the Nintendo 64 would be amazing, and the hype was now at such a level that they could not possibly deliver on it. Critics were as disappointed with the game as I was, who were expecting something much more impressive. The game is different enough in my opinion though, that if enough people enjoy this video, I'll do a standalone video on the history of Killer Instinct Gold. But for this content, I wanted it to be very much Killer Instinct 2 focused. Also, according to many websites I have browsed, Rare actually completely finished making a port of Killer Instinct 2 for the Super Nintendo, which has never seen the light of day. However, I can find no evidence to further substantiate this claim. Although I must admit, it will be an extremely exciting day if a ROM of such a title ever does come to light. Many moons later, the Killer Instinct franchise would be revived on the Xbox One, which is also a story for another time. But a digital port of the game for Xbox One would finally bring the arcade home in 2014. This port of the iconic game that had previously been locked to arcades came bundled with the second season of Killer Instinct 2013, under the title Killer Instinct 2 Classic. So now I guess the boyhood dream has finally come true, and we can all enjoy this title in the privacy of our own bedrooms. Fantastic stuff, eh? So I would say, up until 6 years ago, Killer Instinct 2 was one of the greatest and most iconic games that remained locked to the arcades for so long. The title took 14 years to finally make it home, which is a long time indeed for any arcade conversion. But I guess at least it was a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. Killer Instinct Gold would be a game that would not arrive on the Ultra 64 until late November of 1996 in the US, and not until July bloody 1997 in the UK. A Killer Instinct game was finally available on the Nintendo 64, but in my region at least, years after the time period the game was originally slated for. When it comes to the development of Gold, an interesting factoid is that during the development of Killer Instinct 2, the arcade game, the team would be split during development as soon as the true Nintendo 64 development kit arrived at Rare's headquarters. This would mean that some of the team members would continue to work exclusively on the arcade game, whilst others would be designated to work on Gold. In fact, this could help go to explain why Killer Instinct 2 suffers from some issues the first game in the series didn't. But this is just my personal conjecture at this point. In order to produce Killer Instinct Gold, Rare would take what they had already created for Killer Instinct 2 and use compression technology to fit the arcade version onto a Nintendo 64's very tiny cartridge. The very style cartridge that would stop the majority of developers wanting to even go near the Nintendo 64. As we all know, back in 1994, the first Killer Instinct was designed to be a game that would showcase how powerful the Nintendo 64 was, and how the system was more capable than its competition. However, when Rare eventually received the development kit for the home console, the Nintendo 64 was not really capable of delivering an experience close to the arcade game from 1994. Since Killer Instinct, as we know, was a game that was synonymous with the upcoming Ultra 64 back in the day, Gold would end up being announced as one of the very first launch titles revealed for the hardware. But due to the game not being the easiest to convert from an arcade title over to a console game, the title was delayed, arriving in November 1996 in the US as mentioned earlier, and Europe obviously in mid-1997. On release, Killer Instinct Gold will be presented as an upgraded version of Killer Instinct 2, rather than a butchered port. And to be fair, an argument could be made for the game to be both of these things, as the game gives and takes a lot from the second arcade game. Killer Instinct Gold may suffer from multiple graphical downgrades, but in terms of the gameplay itself, the title does a good job of remaining faithful to the arcade original. In terms of changes, characters no longer have multiple unique endings each, due to the Nintendo 64 small cartridges, and instead only feature one ending each. But not all is negative with this game. The game now features team battles and team elimination battles, the latter of which involves players having to finish their opponents off with actual finishing moves. Basically Mortal Kombat style gory fatalities. Like many home conversions of fighting games, Killer Instinct Gold features a training mode which allows players old and new to learn the moves of each character and practice combos, doubles and auto doubles, etc. Basically all the fighting techniques that are synonymous with Killer Instinct. Again, with the home version of the game, there is now an options menu. This allows players access to a certain level of customization, for example modifying the game speed, colour of blood, button configuration and save data. Lots of simple things really. The game features some unlockables too, for those who persist with it, such as some alternative colours for sprites and some faster gameplay modes. Unlike Killer Instinct in the arcades, Gargos, the game's final boss, is now playable too, with the use of a cheat code. One of the game's most notable changes though from Killer Instinct 2 is the game's stages themselves. The scaling and distorting of full motion video backgrounds used within the arcade version would not fit on Nintendo's cartridges, so instead every level would need to be painstakingly recreated in full 3D. Doing so still allowed for dynamic camera angles to be used at the beginning of battles. These changes resulted in less memory consumption. Speaking of the cartridge's limitations, it would sadly also result in each fighter in the game having fewer animation frames than its arcade counterpart too. If you want to learn more about Killer Instinct's characters, story and gameplay mechanics, I covered all of this in my first two Killer Instinct game videos. And with Killer Instinct Gold basically being an alternative version of Killer Instinct 2, the characters, story and gameplay mechanics included in this game are the same found within that one. So if you want to learn more about those, then I advise you to watch my Killer Instinct 2 video. As for Gold though, let's check out how this game was received when it finally arrived on the Nintendo 64. Yeah! Surprisingly, overall, Gold generally got favourable reviews over that of its arcade counterpart, but many would complain that the title simply did not look good enough for a game that arrived at the end of 1996. IGN, for example, would go as far to comment that apart from looking dated, the characters themselves have a cheesy 80s feel and do not fit into a modern product. IGN would add though that they liked Gold's crisp music, but felt the game should have added more characters to the roster to make the game feel more separate to that of Killer Instinct 2, which would have been a welcome addition to the game to be fair, as 11 fighters in a fighting game that never arrived in my country until 1997 did not feel like very many to me either. GameSpot would proclaim Gold to be the most refined version of Killer Instinct ever made, but like many of the reviewers noted how dated the experience was compared to Nintendo 64 games from other genres, thus noting that only those most desperate for a Nintendo 64 fighting game should bother purchasing this one. Next Generation and N64 magazine both commented that Tekken 2 and Virtua Fighter 2 both made Killer Instinct Gold look extremely primitive, thus outclassing the cartridge-based experience. In N64 magazine's conclusion, they would harshly draw that even in the Nintendo 64's meagre catalogue of titles, Killer Instinct Gold does not distinguish itself, and thus had a lifespan of weeks rather than months. Killer Instinct Gold waned from a celebrated announcement to a quiet release. Next Generation would scathingly write that the controls in the game were as awkward as they were on the Super NES, and ultimately wrote that the game was not much fun. Across the board, review sources would note that like many Nintendo 64 games to come, the game suffers from blurriness. To top it off, by this point in time, journalists were no longer impressed by Killer Instinct's quirky combo system. For example, IGN would write that this shallow emphasis on archaic combo sequence memorization prevented creative improvisation. CVG wrote that Gold had little flow. Every match was focused on huge combos rather than small strategic moves. I guess the biggest problem looking back at Killer Instinct on the Nintendo 64 was that by the time the platform reached homes, Killer Instinct was dated in both graphical style and presentation. Pre-rendered sprites as seen in Killer Instinct and Donkey Kong Country in 1994 now looked dated as hell on 64-bit hardware. 2.5 years removed from the first arcade game's release, and the fact that the game was graphically scaled back from the original did not help matters much either. Killer Instinct Gold did not look like an impressive early game on the 64. I can confirm that during the Christmas period that I received the system, my family would buy me 4 games that year, and Killer Instinct Gold was the title I certainly played the least of the 4, as it simply did not wow me and blow me away in the same way that Mario 64, Lilac Wars and Mario Kart 64 did. The game just felt primitive in comparison, and when you consider that it was basically a scaled back title from 1994, I guess it really was primitive. On my Sony PlayStation, I would purchase Tekken 2 and Tekken 3, and I remember playing those 2 games to death with my friends. We never tended to give Killer Instinct Gold the same love and attention. It felt like a relic of the past, almost dead on arrival. Overall resulting in Rare not bothering to release another Killer Instinct game for many years. The game's popularity declined almost as quickly as it rose, as 3D polygon model gaming quickly took over the world. Despite these criticisms though, ironically a strong case can now be argued that Killer Instinct Gold is actually now one of the better Nintendo 64 games to both look at and play today, as although it aged quickly at first, in 2020 it is nowhere near as ugly as most Nintendo 64 games look now. Also to add to this, rather amusingly, despite being one of the first traditional versus fighting games on the Nintendo 64, the game was never topped on the hardware. No high quality polygon fighters like Tekken or Virtua Fighter were ever published for the system in my opinion. So despite its flaws to this day, hilariously, this rough around the edges title is remembered as the greatest traditional fighting game that was ever released for Nintendo's gimped hardware, as most third-party publishers were simply not interested in this so-called Project Reality system. So whilst the game was arguably dead on its arrival, the game is still the best traditional fighter the 64 ever delivered. It would seem that the Nintendo 64 was not truly capable of delivering an optimum Killer Instinct experience. Keeping this in mind, then why the bloody hell does this exist? An 8-bit conversion of the advanced for its time arcade game. Either way, the fact that this title exists is yet further proof that the line available in your homes in 1995 only for the Ultra 64 was certainly a complete and total lie. So, whilst at this port today, we are going to be looking at this port today. See what I did there? A Game Boy version of the game was created to emulate a title that was purposely made to showcase the potential power of the Ultra 64. It all seems paradoxical to me on so many levels, so let's take an in-depth look at how this game came about and if this outrageous title lived up to the Killer Instinct branding whatsoever. The Killer Instinct Game Boy was released in a period commonly known as the Play It Loud era. Play It Loud was a campaign that was being ran by Nintendo at the time to promote their new line of obnoxious looking, brightly coloured Game Boys. Whilst Atari, Sega and NEC had all offered full colour gameplay experiences on the go years prior, Nintendo were only now reaching the stage where gamers could introduce a bit of colour into their lives, but via the handheld shells rather than the actual in-game action. Radical bloody stuff. In this era of loud garishness, in June of 1995, Nintendo and Rare would shock the world with the release of Donkey Kong Land on the Game Boy platform. This was only 1 year removed from the release of Donkey Kong Country on the Super Nintendo, a game that, like Killer Instinct, wowed players with its pre-rendered graphics that used 3D models created using Silicon Graphics computers. In a surprising turn of events, many of Donkey Kong Country's background elements, character models and sound effects were directly ported from the Super Nintendo game onto the 8-bit Game Boy title. resulting in impressive results with a game that retained the same style as the original. Like Killer Instinct, Donkey Kong Country was certainly a game which many people would attribute its success levels to its fantastic visuals, which is why it was so unexpected to see Silicon Graphics rendered games popping up on the Game Boy. Rare would even poke fun at this situation themselves with the game, even making it part of the title's story, which chronologically takes place straight after the Super Nintendo game. In Donkey Kong Land, Diddy and Donkey reflect on their previous adventure, but out of jealousy, Cranky Kong scolds for both of them regarding their success, implying that Donkey Kong Country only sold so well because of the elaborate graphics and sound the Super Nintendo could deliver. Irritated by this, the young Kongs explain they earned their success because of the fun gameplay and not just the graphics and sound. This results in Cranky teasing his juniors by stating they could not replicate the success of their past game on a monochrome 8-bit handheld, causing Donkey Kong and Diddy to accept his gaming challenge, which sees him calling King K. Rool and his Kremlins to steal Donkey Kong's bananas and scatter them across Donkey Kong Island once again. The effort put forward to create this game was universally praised, as despite the Game Boy's limitations in gameplay mechanics that needed to be changed to better suit the hardware, the title was surprisingly good and faithful in experience to the original. But what about Killer Instinct on the system? Could it even give players a taste of the Ultra 64 arcade game? With regards to the making of this game, the same techniques seem to have been applied to create the title that were implemented into the creation of Donkey Kong Land. Like Land, Killer Instinct for the Game Boy features background elements, character models and music that were featured in the Super Nintendo game being ported over to the more humble platform. According to the game's manual, yes, I owned a bloody manual for this one, it hypes the game up by stating the arcade hit goes portable. 9 of the original arcade characters have been faithfully recreated to deliver arcade experience on the Game Boy. It is of note that if you played the arcade version of the original game, there are 11 characters included in total, but this version omits both Cinder and Riptor from the playable lineup, which was obviously a move that was implemented due to the Game Boy's limitations. What I find more interesting about this though, is that this Game Boy game was released in November of 1995. A calendar year before the release of Killer Instinct 2 in the arcades, a game that would also omit these 2 characters, but on that occasion in favour of new ones. Thus meaning this Game Boy game illustrated which characters the Rare team favoured prior to the release of the next entry in the series. At least in the 8-bit game though, we can still play as Chief Thunder. Despite a smaller lineup, 9 is still a decent selection of fighters for an 8-bit Game Boy game, and the roster is bigger and more impressive than what can be found in the Game Boy Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter 2 games previously, meaning the game was an ambitious effort on many levels away from the graphical style itself, with this great fighter selection being a prime example. Like with all games ported over to the Game Boy, aside from the system's graphical prowess, another factor that programmers must contend with is making a game playable with the Game Boy's simple 2-button layout in mind, which is obviously a major departure from the Super Nintendo's 6 buttons if we include the L and R button shoulder triggers. Despite these limitations, Killer Instinct for Game Boy still manages to let players perform fast-paced multiple attack combos that helped make this franchise so famous in the first place. To compensate for the lack of buttons available on the device, the same button is often implemented to perform various maneuvers, such as a tap of the A button allows players to perform a weak kick, whereas holding it allows for a fierce kick, and the B button functions in the same manner to allow for different strengths of punches. Tapping up allows players to jump, and combining inputs of the directional pad with the A and B button allows players to perform many of the franchise's satisfying looking combos. In fact, all of the game's mechanics from previous versions have been carried over in one way or another, including special moves, charge moves, roll moves, and of course the famous combo breakers. Moves that can be executed to end extended hit combos. In fact, even ultra combos are back, if players fancy making their opponents truly humble. Obviously, the Game Boy's limited control scheme doesn't allow for an experience quite like the other versions, but it's still a cracking effort with everything else considered. The ground rules of combat in the game are the same as with the other entries in the series, and victory is achieved when a fighter depletes both of their opponent's life bars. Like the first game, and most fighting games in general to be fair, in the game's main play mode, combatants must defeat every player found in the game, including the boss fight in the final throws. This means that Idle makes a return to action in the game, who can also be played as using cheat codes. The game also has a practice mode, but a more surprising feature in my opinion is the game's link mode, which allows 2 players of the game to fight against each other using 2 Game Boys, 2 cartridges and a Game Boy link cable. The game link function allows 2 players to go head to head. Something else worth noting about this title is that it is one of the Game Boy titles that featured enhancements if played using the Super Game Boy add-on on the Super Nintendo. Basically, when the game is played in this manner, the title features a more varied colour selection than just monochrome green, and the action is all framed by a custom Killer Instinct border too. Nice. So, I guess to summarise, if you are looking for an arcade-like Killer Instinct experience, you are definitely not going to find it with this simplistic Game Boy port. However, it is still great to see what the development team who made this game were capable of, considering the severe limitations that were obviously imposed when getting a game like this running on such hardware. At the end of the day, it is cool to see a high-end arcade game appearing on the Game Boy, and the fact that it is even playable and replicates many of the tropes of the series is an accomplishment in itself. It is also awesome to hear the game's fantastic soundtrack in 8-bit for a change. In some ways the game is worth checking out just to hear that, as it is very novel. Overall though, that is all I feel I have to say about this game really. It is what it is. But it is a fun curiosity that is part of a major franchise, even if it isn't anything else. Killer Instinct for the Game Boy bloody exists, it's playable, and that's all we could have hoped for really. I'd argue that this version is less of a disappointment than Killer Instinct Gold, as no one expected a perfect Killer Instinct game on the Game Boy, yet we expected to see so much more on the upcoming Ultra 64. Overall, I'm pleased that I own this oddity amongst my collection, as it is such an awesome little talking point, and if I'm ever in the mood, I always have the option to play it loud. Looking back now, it's difficult to appreciate just how impactful the first Killer Instinct was in both the arcades and within the fighting game community. Developers Rare could essentially do no wrong at the time and were fast becoming the darlings of the industry at that point. After being well established for many years, churning out solid, varied and respected, but ultimately not massively noteworthy titles, people really started to stand up and take notice of the British devs internally after the Battletoads series blew up. While this was the case, it was 1994's Super Nintendo masterpiece Donkey Kong Country that elevated them to legendary status in both fans' and critics' eyes. The hype for the game was astounding, and it had one of the biggest marketing campaigns ever seen in the video game industry, causing borderline Donkey Kong Country hysteria. Despite the fact that Killer Instinct had actually launched to American arcades a few weeks before the release of Donkey Kong Country, it was very much seen as Rare's successor to the immensely popular SNES platformer, so expectations for the development team's official first entry in the tournament fighter genre was almost unrealistically high. Thankfully, those clever little British boffins were almost as adept at programming fighting games as they were at making quirky platformers, and their novel take on the genre was an instant hit. Incorporating pre-rendered sprites that absolutely blew the tiny primitive minds of the inhabitants of late 1994, far more detailed character animations than had been seen in fighting games previously, and a combo system unlike anything that preceded it, Killer Instinct both looked and played like a mid-90s dream, and by the summer of 1995 it had received over 500 million arcade plays and multiple home ports. This was just the beginning for the juggernaut that was Rare, as they continued to churn out beloved hit after beloved hit throughout the rest of the 90s and into the early 2000s. Almost unparalleled in their success for a company of that size, the next 7 years would see them release the likes of Donkey Kong Country 2, GoldenEye, Diddy Kong Racing, Banjo-Kazooie, Donkey Kong 64, Perfect Dark and Conker's Bad Fur Day, just to name a few. An already successful relationship with Nintendo, established during the NES and Super Nintendo life cycles, became even more successful after the transition to the powerful 64-bit behemoth known only to us mere mortals as the N64. Or maybe the Ultra 64 if your memory is really that good. With such a preposterous partnership between the two parties, one would presume it would be prudent to persist with such a profitable pairing, but astoundingly, Rare only ever actually released one game for the entire lifespan of Nintendo's 6th generation console, the GameCube, that being 2002 Star Fox Adventures, which, although well received at the time, strayed too far from the Star Fox formula to be very fondly remembered. Despite this, Star Fox Adventures ended up being a big seller for the system, and it appeared that Rare even had the backing of Shigeru Miyamoto, as it was him that personally requested the British devs handle the project. This kind of support from within the company meant that many insiders expected Nintendo to purchase shares in Rare to ensure that the partnership would continue. But shockingly, no deal or offer ever emerged, and it became evident Nintendo had no desire or intention of backing the company financially at all. It seems a rise in development costs and a desire to increase focus on in-house studios were factors behind the Big N's decision, but no real concrete answer has been given as to why no purchase ever came, and this is a subject that has caused much speculation over the years. Even Rare's co-founder Tim Stamper was at a loss to explain why the partnership fizzled out, and a deal was never struck, stating, "I've no idea why they didn't do that. I thought we were a good fit." Meanwhile, the corporate giants over at Microsoft were in the process of getting ready to start work on their swanky new 7th generation system, the Xbox 360, and they were in a position to start throwing wads loads of that sweet Bill Gates cash all over the development and promotion of their new exciting hardware. With the Rare team somewhat in limbo following their Nintendo snub, Microsoft decided now was the right time to swoop in and attempt to purchase them, which they eventually did for a cool $375 million, after pricing out Activision and making Rare a first-party developer for the company, not a fee to be sniffed at. I think perhaps Bill Gates is the first person to make more profit from Windows than George Formby. With such an exciting new partnership emerging, with fresh technology on the horizon, and finally some real committed financial backing, hopes were high for the future of Rare software under the Microsoft umbrella. It seemed almost inevitable that things would go from strength to strength for them, but it didn't take long for the proverbial wheels to start falling off. In fact, their first Microsoft game, released for the original Xbox, the very immaturely and not particularly amusingly named Grabbed by the Ghoulies, was considered Rare's worst effort to date. Not the start that one might hope for, and it didn't really get too much better from there. Disappointing sales, lack of advertising and marketing, particularly compared to other in-house developed Xbox 360 releases, key members of the dev and management team leaving to pursue other opportunities, and a clear dwindling faith from Microsoft in the once mighty British company gave little cause for positivity around Rare at the time. Even relatively well-received games such as Perfect Dark Zero and the Viva Pinata series were considered disappointments by the Microsoft overlords due to their poor sales performances, and so the decision was made to have the company's focus be shifted to developing games for the fledgling Kinect add-on. Quite the depressing fall from grace, really. Once considered one of the most innovative and seriously bloody creative developers out there, Rare were now being reduced to churning out what would basically amount to Wii Sports knockoffs. Oh dear, oh dear. The news of another new Microsoft console, the Xbox One, being almost ready to hit store shelves gave the poor depressed little buggers over at Rare some hope, as a project to revive one of their most popular IPs from the 90s had been greenlit as a launch game for the new system. Killer Instinct was finally going to get a new iteration. There had been quite a bit of interest in bringing Killer Instinct back from the dead for a number of years from several Rare employees. These included well-respected Microsoft Studios director and original Killer Instinct designer Ken Lobb. So in 2012, Microsoft applied for renewal of the Killer Instinct trademark, and those proverbial wheels from before were back again, but this time in motion rather than falling off. Unfortunately, Rare's cause for celebration wasn't quite as big as first hoped, as it seemed Microsoft's previously established lack of faith in them was still prevalent, and they would only have Rare overseeing development, with assistance from Ken Lobb, with a lion's share of the work going to little-known Californian studio Double Helix Games. It was clear from the off that Double Helix wanted to make sure they had a good, solid fighting game pedigree, and there were a lot of credible people in the field working on the title. Notable names from both the development and competitive side of the fighting game communities were brought on board, such as respected tournament organiser Adam Hart and former Capcom employee and Weapon Lord creator James Goddard. Why they couldn't have gone with Killer Instinct 3, Killer Instinct HD, or any other more sensible name you could think of is beyond me, but the confusingly titled Killer Instinct was released as a free-to-play game, with all game modes available, but only one selectable character to pick, to coincide with the launch of the Xbox One in November 2013. In a rather ingenious marketing ploy, the one character that is available to select in the free version would rotate at timed intervals, giving grotty little impoverished peasants that couldn't afford all the characters the chance to try new ones out for themselves, provided they keep coming back to play the game at specific times. Extra fighters were released according to seasons, similar to what we've seen with recent Street Fighter games, including various extra outfits and further online content for individual characters. The game itself made use of the all-new Hex engine, which was based on the previously established and very metal sounding Slayer engine, and although capable of a wide variety of functions, was specifically made with fighting games in mind. The mastermind behind this new engine was the previously mentioned James Goddard, who is a bit of a fighting game legend by all accounts, and the man responsible for Champions Edition of Street Fighter II and Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting. Double Helix's main goal early on was to understand exactly what made the original Killer Instinct a success, and vehemently stick to that formula, whilst also making a product that would appeal to modern sensibilities. They concluded that the series was established on a foundation of bombastic audio and graphical effects, an almost bombardment on the senses of sight and sound with insane announcers screaming at you every time you do anything half decent, extreme violence and absolutely ridiculous combos that are simply way more over the top than in almost any other fighting franchise. The fact the game provided such an authentic Killer Instinct experience, based on those factors, was seen as one of the biggest positives during the first season, and it ensured that old school fans of the series were very much on board right away. Despite the game not actually starting out as an Xbox One title, with tentative development beginning on the 360, Double Helix and the Hex engine made excellent use of the new hardware, with Killer Instinct being an absolute treat on the eyes, chock full of stunning visual effects, impressively fluid animations, and a blistering and extremely steady frame rate. For such an early Xbox One title, it's quite a technical marvel really. The soundtrack is similarly well done, with some of the most intense, pounding metal riffs this sound of the Doom reboot, alongside some of the more memorable hooks and tracks from recent memory, providing an incredibly fitting backdrop, with every piece of music feeling like it matches its setting perfectly. Gameplay is tight and fun with a perfect blend of simplistic and easy to get into it, but also deep and difficult to master, with each character playing differently but still feeling well balanced. Reviews were similarly positive, with the only real enduring criticism of the game being directed towards the lack of content available on launch, an initial lack of any serious story mode. The general consensus seemed to be that if these issues were rectified, we could have a bit of a classic on our hands. Speaking of classic, many of the franchise favourites of yesteryear were back, with 1994 iconic characters such as Jago, Orchid, Volgor and more all seeing a return, with even a new character being brought into the mix known as Sadira, who has been ordered to assassinate other competitors in the competition. The somewhat bumpy road and not insignificant amount of adversity that Killer Instinct had faced on its way to being released would continue, as just as the game was finding its feet within the ever-demanding fighting game community, developers Double Helix would get some dirty Bezos money thrown their way, as they got bought out by the capitalistic pig dogs over at bloody Amazon of all places. This would leave the future of the game in great uncertainty, as there were still several more seasons of characters and vast amounts of content scheduled to be released yet, Supposedly, staff at Double Helix were gutted about having to abandon the project, as it was so personal to them, and apparently held out hope that Microsoft would counter Amazon's offer in an attempt to keep hold of them. But that offer never materialised, and the dev team were left disappointed. I'm sure the massive stacks of evil spaceman Bezos's cash they were now sitting on cheered them up at least a little bit though. To heroically save the day, in stepped those bloody lovely people from fledgling studio Iron Galaxy to take control of the project and attempt to get the rest of those seasons out, as well as continue to update and support the game in lieu of Double Helix's acquisition by Amazon. It was seen as a huge risk on the part of Microsoft to entirely hand over the reins of the project to a completely different studio on the other side of the country, but the Chicago-based Iron Galaxy CEO, Dave Lang, actually went so far as to fly a team of devs out to Double Helix's offices in California for a full week to learn exactly how to use and get the most out of the Hex engine. Most insiders assumed that handing the project over from one team to another would be a disaster, as things of this nature usually are. But the commitment shown by Iron Galaxy and the fact that Double Helix clearly wanted to see the game succeed as well, and were doing everything they could to aid in the process, meant the transition was an almost seamless one. Many classic fan favourite characters from the original game were set to be added, as well as several totally new ones, and Iron Galaxy vowed to not only maintain the expected high standard on all of them, but also expand and refine several of the gameplay aspects Double Helix had established in Season 1. It seems that their commitment to the product paid off, as despite having a fraction of the amount of time with the engine, many consider the seasons of Killer Instinct that Iron Galaxy were in charge of to be superior to Double Helix's efforts. Due to their hard work, the game would be hugely expanded upon, and the roster would be tripled, adding tons of new characters and returning greats too. In a surprising twist, even Rash was added to the game, one of the heroes from the Battletoads franchise, who had previously helped put Rare on the map. Without Battletoads, there would be no Killer Instinct, so this was a lovely nod. As if the small Chicago studio's workload wasn't crazy enough, they were also presented with the daunting task of porting the game over to Windows, Steam, and making cross-network play between both platforms possible. In spite of their relatively minuscule budget, they actually managed to not only succeed in this endeavour, but also do a much better bloody job of it than several far better financed games. Network play for Killer Instinct is often lauded as one of the best online experiences you can have with a fighting game. Seriously, impressive stuff. It's hard not to consider 2013's Killer Instinct a success, particularly given all the obstacles that were thrown in its way. It really was positioned to be a game that could not possibly succeed, but as is evidenced by its sustained popularity, the overall quality of the product, the demand for multiple physical versions of the initially digital-only title, and the fact that it literally headlined several high-profile fighting game tournaments, it's undeniable that it did. The press have had a lot of nice things to say about this game, with IGN stating, "Not only is its combat system flashy and well thought out, it's well explained too, thanks to its powerful training tools, and what is easily the most complete guide to terminology and tactics ever assembled in a fighting game. Killer Instinct delivers where it counts." GameSpot would write, "Killer Instinct successfully updates the 90s classic into a finely tuned competitive fighter that can stand alongside the genre's regulars. Its muscle-bound roster conveys a satisfying sense of weight and force with their movements, while still feeling responsive to your commands. There is a lot of flexibility in combo authorship, but the combo and counter breakers help keep both fighters on their toes even as the hit count rises." By Season 3, praise was still being lumped on the game, with Destructoid writing, "Since its release, Killer Instinct has slowly become one of the most competent fighters in the genre. It's accessible at all levels thanks to its approachable yet deep combo system and extensive tutorials. Its characters, including the new ones from Season 3, all have unique mechanics and tons of small touches that bring them to life. With an efficient and non-scummy free-to-play model and PC availability, there are few reasons not to jump into Killer Instinct." There is no doubt by this point that Killer Instinct was a success. Many gamers adored the return of this class and continue to wish for even more. Despite this, Microsoft have been more cagey than a TNA Lockdown pay-per-view about whether there will be a new game, or even any further updates, with barely a whisper about Killer Instinct in over 4 years. But given that we're extremely early in the current generation of consoles lifespan, and there had previously been a 17-year gap between Killer Instinct games, there's still hope. So who knows what's next for the franchise's future? Videos like this are in part made possible by the wonderful people who back this channel on Patreon. Speaking of this, special thank yous go out to A Murder of Crows, Carl Johnson, Heo Paulo Lopez, Nostalgia Collector, Ben Harradine, Corey Imar Sr., Ron Dinch, Evan Border, Philip Namph, Azarakai, Dropkin Varela, Michael Cullix, Ego, Jordan Durant, Ian Boyle, Nick Daniels, Princess Sana, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of the Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Johnny Holly, August Piazza, Justin Wang, Capcom vs SNK, Hermes Gonzalez, Man Shovel, Michael Hall, Sang Hee, Norma Stitz, Langston Miller, Noob, Sarah Powell, Flaming Renee, Marvin Araliga, TOG Driver, Lewis Viant, John Bates, David Bow, Chris Fisk, Rick67, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Synth Spaces, Punk Toast, and everybody else who backs what I do on the Patreon platform. As the legendary King of Pop, Michael Jackson would say, thank you very much. Cheerio.